May 19, 1985. Finnish Highway, USSR border. A man lay in the trunk of a Ford Sierra, sedated to a state British medics delicately called manageable incapacitation. He was wrapped in a sleeping bag, an oxygen mask on his face in case the air ran out before border guards finished their search. Next to him, an MI6 female officer held a crying baby, specifically brought along so that border dogs wouldn't detect the scent of a living adult body through the baby's diapers and the smell of ammonia. British intelligence had been preparing Operation Pimlico for 11 years. The man in the trunk was Oleg Gordievsky, a KGB colonel, head of Soviet intelligence in London, and an MI6 agent since 1974. He had already fallen under suspicion. He had been recalled from London under a plausible pretext and subjected to weeks of interrogation, plied with tea containing truth serum-like drugs. But Gordievsky held firm. They couldn't prove anything, and never would, because a man who had lived a double life for 20 years knew how to keep silent at a physiological level. Yet, they had no intention of letting him go free. He acted first. To understand how a KGB officer ended up in the trunk of a British car, one must rewind 20 years to Helsinki in 1964. To a young residency officer who read Solzhenitsyn in translation, listened to the BBC on shortwave radio, and thought about things that were not permitted in the KGB. The first thing to understand about this story is why he betrayed them. Gordievsky never used the word betrayal to describe his actions. In this, he fundamentally differed from most defectors who either justify themselves or revel in their role. He called what he did resistance. Money was not the primary factor, or rather, it was an important fact, but not the main one. Gordievsky lived on a modest British agent's salary, by his own account. MI6 didn't buy him. They found a man who had already made a decision within himself and was merely awaiting the moment when that decision could be materialized into action. The turning point began in 1961. The Berlin Wall. Gordievsky was in Moscow, listening to the radio when it was announced that the city had been cut in half by barbed wire overnight. He was a young KGB school cadet, raised in the Soviet system with its logic and language. But something within him, not ideological, rather aesthetic, almost physical, told him, "You don't do that to people." The wall was not a defense against Western aggression, as the radio explained. The wall was a cage, and whoever builds a cage either fears their animals or hates them. Next came Prague in 1968. Gordievsky was serving in Denmark at the Soviet embassy when Soviet tanks rolled into Czechoslovakia. He witnessed the reaction of the Danes, not politicians but ordinary people on the street. He saw the faces of colleagues from non-communist countries who had greeted him in the embassy corridors that morning, but by evening looked through him as if he were glass. The crushing of the Prague Spring was not just a political decision by Moscow. It was a moral choice by the system he served, a system that chose tank treads over negotiations. From that moment, he began to think differently, not yet to act, but only to think. But he thought in a way that became noticeable. How MI6 approached him is a story not officially told. Gordievsky did not walk into the British embassy and knock on the door. That path was the quickest route to Soviet counterintelligence, which maintained surveillance on every entrance to every Western diplomatic establishment. He signaled in other ways, slowly, deliberately, using a method that could be described as intentional transparency for those who knew how to look. At diplomatic receptions in Copenhagen, where he was then working undercover, he allowed himself certain remarks, not political statements, not direct criticism of the Soviet system. Something else. A slight disagreement with Moscow's official position on a minor issue. An interest in Western culture expressed a little more strongly than his cover story allowed. Irony, subtle, almost imperceptible, directed at Soviet rhetoric. All of it on the edge. All of it something a KGB colleague might attribute to. Fatigue or one too many drinks. But it was also something a professional Western counterintelligence officer, skilled at reading people, would interpret as a signal. And then there was his apartment. Soviet officers on foreign assignments lived knowing their apartments were bugged. This wasn't paranoia. It was standard procedure. MI6 bugged Soviet personnel with the same methodical approach they used for their own agents. Loyalty checks, monitoring sentiments, controlling contacts. Gordievsky knew this. and Gordievsky spoke to his wife at home precisely as if someone were listening. Not conspiratorially, not in whispers. That was precisely what he should not do. Rather the opposite. Openly, naturally, in conversations conducted as if no recording existed. In these conversations, he allowed himself what a Soviet KGB officer should not. Sympathy for dissidents, admiration for Western literature, quiet, everyday disagreement with the system's logic. This was a calculation, a signal. Encoded in daily life. British intelligence read him for several years before making direct contact. The recruitment conversation took place in Copenhagen in 1974. Without pressure, without threats, without compromising material. None of that was needed. Gordievsky came to it himself, internally. MI6 simply opened a door he was already pushing from the other side. What exactly did he leak? Gordievsky worked for British intelligence for 11 years, from 1974 to 1985. During this time, he rose from an officer in the Copenhagen residency to the resident in London, meaning the head of the entire Soviet intelligence network in Great Britain. This meant the value of the information he transmitted grew with each promotion. The initial period in Denmark provided the British with a complete picture of the Soviet residency's operations in Scandinavia. Recruitment methods, covers used, operational aliases of active officers, and communication schemes with Moscow. Some of this. Information was used immediately, leading to several Soviet intelligence officers being quietly declared persona non grata without explanations that might reveal the source. But the most significant transmissions began when he arrived in London. In 1982, Gordievsky was assigned to the British capital as deputy KGB resident. In 1984, he became the resident. This was the pinnacle of the Soviet intelligence hierarchy in the most important Western capital. He saw everything. First, and perhaps most important, was Operation Ryan. Ryan stood for Raketno-Yadernoye Napadenie, or nuclear missile attack. In the early 80s, at the peak of tensions between the Reagan administration and the USSR, the Politburo genuinely, paranoids, but genuinely, feared a preemptive nuclear strike from the United States. The KGB received a directive to create a global early warning system to detect preparations for an American first strike. Residencies worldwide received lists of indicators too. Monitor, ranging from blood supply levels in hospitals to activity in government bunkers. Gordievsky handed over the complete Ryan document package to MI6, instructions, lists of indicators, and operational directives. This gave London and Washington something invaluable, an understanding that the Soviet leadership was genuinely frightened. That behind the rhetoric lay not aggressive calculation but fear, irrational but authentic. When NATO conducted its Able Archer exercise in November 1983, a simulation of nuclear strike procedures, the Soviet side reacted as if preparing for actual war. They put their nuclear forces on high alert. Reconnaissance planes moved to combat positions. The West didn't understand what was happening until they read the analysis based on Gordievsky's materials. Reagan, according to his advisors, was stunned. He hadn't thought the Soviet leadership took the threat literally. This directly and demonstrably changed his rhetoric and his policy toward. The USSR historians still debate whether this moment was one of those that prevented a real war. Second were the KGB agent networks in the United Kingdom. Gordievsky named Soviet agents and sources working for the KGB on British territory. Not all of them, as he didn't know every single one, but those he did know. Among those exposed was Michael Bettany, an MI5 officer who, in 1983, attempted to approach the KGB on his own and offer his services. Gordievsky immediately informed the British side of this approach. Bettany was arrested in 1984 and sentenced to 23 years. This was a paradox that MI6 appreciated with dry British irony. A Soviet agent within British intelligence exposed a British agent attempting to become a Soviet agent. Third were political assessments. In 1984, when Mikhail Gorbachev visited London, still a Politburo member rather than General Secretary, it was Gordievsky who prepared an analytical memo for the KGB on how the Soviet delegation should engage with their British counterparts. This same memo, interpreted by MI6, landed on Margaret Thatcher's desk before her meeting with Gorbachev. The phrase Thatcher uttered after that meeting, "We can do business with this man," became one of the key statements in the history of the end of the Cold War. The extent to which this assessment was shaped by Gordievsky's materials is a subject of discussion. However, the fact that MI6 used his analysis in preparing the British side for negotiations is confirmed. Fourth were methods and structures. Over 11 years, Gordievsky provided a complete picture of how the KGB operated in the West. Not just lists of names, but the operational logic, how cover was built, how sources were recruited, how communication was organized, what internal reporting looked like. This was institutional knowledge that allowed MI6 and the CIA, for years to come, to understand Soviet intelligence not as a black box, but as a known mechanism with a blueprint in hand. And now for the most interesting part, how he came under suspicion. In February 1985, in Washington, the KGB recruited a new American source. His name was Aldrich Ames, a CIA analyst and head of the Soviet Counterintelligence Division, with access to the names of all American agents in the USSR and all Soviet agents working for the CIA in the West. At his very first meeting with his Soviet handler, Ames laid out a stack of documents and named names. In a matter of hours, he destroyed most of the American spy network in the USSR. Among the names he revealed was Gordievsky's. The KGB received information about Ames in May 1985. Gordievsky was recalled from London under the pretext of consultations, immediately, without the usual diplomatic preparation that takes weeks. This in itself was a signal to those who knew how to read such signals. In Moscow, he was subjected to weeks of surveillance, covert operations, tea with drugs, presumably scopolamine derivatives, substances that impair speech control, interrogations that were conducted not as interrogations but as friendly conversations with colleagues. This was a classic Soviet technique. A person who knows they are being investigated remains guarded, but a person lulled into believing they are merely being questioned about work relaxes. Gordievsky did not relax. He said just enough so they couldn't arrest him, and just enough so he didn't appear suspiciously silent. This balance was the result not of special training but of character. He was a man who had lived in two realities simultaneously for so long that it had become physiological. He was not arrested, but he was not allowed to return to London either. He was placed under house surveillance. Effectively, a soft arrest without official status. Here, an emergency signal came into play. Gordievsky had an agreement with the British side from the very beginning about a distress signal, simple and invisible. If he found himself in danger and wanted evacuation, he was to appear at a specific time, in a specific place in Moscow, holding a bun, literally. A man with a bun at a particular shop at a specific time on a specific day of the week. No electronics, no intermediaries, no radio communication that could be intercepted. A primitiveness that made the signal. Reliable. He went. He stood there, bun in hand. A British officer drove past in a car and saw him. Operation Pimlico was activated. The escape. Details that make it sound like a movie. But it was real. MI6 had developed an evacuation plan in case a source in Moscow was compromised. Detailed, well thought out, with several backup options. Gordievsky had been briefed on this plan in London. He remembered every element. Several days after he gave the signal were spent on preparations by the British side. The operational team in Moscow was minimal, a few people from the embassy. An operation of this kind does not tolerate a large number of people. Each additional person is an additional risk. Gordievsky, meanwhile, continued to live his normal routine. He went to work. Socialized with colleagues. Visited acquaintances. Surveillance noted a routine that gave no cause for alarm. On the designated day, he went for a run. This was normal. He ran regularly, and surveillance was accustomed to his route. At a certain point on the route, he simply did not return. He got into a car that was waiting for him at the agreed-upon location. The British team worked with an efficiency possible only when a plan is practiced to automation, and when every participant understands that the price of error is measured in human life. The Finnish border was about 500 kilometers away, several hours' drive. Gordievsky was in the trunk, not because it was the only solution, but because it was the only solution offering an acceptable probability of passing border control. Soviet border guards at the Finnish crossing operated under instructions developed by the KGB precisely to prevent such evacuations. They inspected diplomatic corps cars with an attention that formally violated diplomatic immunity, but which all parties tacitly allowed. Dogs at the border were a real problem, specially trained to find people in enclosed spaces. The British side solved this problem with diapers. The smell of a baby and ammonia masked what the dog should have smelled. The car crossed the border. On the Finnish side, Gordievsky was removed from the trunk, revived, and given time. Then, Helsinki. Then, London. In Moscow, the KGB discovered his disappearance several hours later. By that time, the border was behind him, his subsequent life, the price he paid. In London, he was debriefed for several months, systematically, methodically, section by section. Everything he knew, everything he remembered, everything he had seen over 11 years. MI6 received material that it processed for years. Some of these materials form the basis of analysis that British and American intelligence services used to assess the Soviet leadership in the final years of the Cold War. Then came a life that could hardly be called normal. He received British citizenship, a pension, a small house in a London suburb. The exact address was not, and is not, publicly disclosed to this day. MI6 provided him with protection, discreet, constant. Not because it was a tradition for defectors, but because the KGB, which became the FSB, never closed his case. His family remained in the Soviet Union. This was the price he paid immediately and continued to pay for many years. His wife, she either did not know about his work for the British, or knew partially, or suspected, but there was no one to answer a direct question, remained in Moscow with their 2 daughters. The Soviet side used them as hostages, not publicly declared, but creating conditions where any public step he took would result in pressure on his family. He did not see his daughters for several years. Reunification with his family, incomplete and painful, became possible only after the collapse of the USSR. By that time, his daughters had grown up without him. The marriage did not survive. This is a story Gordievsky rarely tells, and without the analytical detachment with which he speaks of intelligence operations. His public life in exile proved to be busy. Books, several, co-authored with historian Christopher Andrew, including a monumental work on the history of the KGB that became a standard source for Western researchers. Lectures, consultations, press commentary. He became not just a defector, but an expert, a man whose understanding of Soviet and Russian intelligence was based not on archives, but on personal involvement. In 2007, Alexander Litvinenko, another defector from Russian special services, was poisoned in London with polonium-210, leading to a slow, agonizing death. The British investigation determined that the operation was sanctioned at the highest levels of the Russian state. Gordievsky was one of the few who publicly and extensively commented on this case. He knew Litvinenko. He knew how the system worked. He understood that the poisoning was not a criminal dispute or personal revenge. It was a signal, a state-sanctioned, demonstrative signal precisely calculated to be heard by everyone in the same position as Gordievsky. He himself survived one assassination attempt. In 2021, he experienced a sharp deterioration in his health after meeting a person later linked to Russian special services. The British side conducted an investigation. There is no official confirmation. Unofficially, everyone who follows such stories understands what this episode means. He continues to live in Britain, continues to give interviews, continues to comment. In the 2020s, old, cautious, with security that has remained for 40 years, he remains one of the most informed living sources on how Soviet intelligence operated. In Russia, he was officially condemned in absentia in 1985, a few months after his escape. The sentence was death, under Soviet law. After the collapse of the USSR, the verdict was formally not overturned, although the death penalty is not applied in practice in Russia. It's a legal curiosity that no one in Moscow finds amusing. His case is closed there in the sense that they officially prefer not to talk about him. This, too, is a kind of assessment. A failure of Soviet intelligence of such magnitude, 11 years, a resident in London, Operation Ryan, Bettany, Gorbachev, is not something that is usually brought up. Ames, the man who betrayed him, was arrested by the CIA in 1994. Sentenced to life imprisonment. During interrogations, he claimed that by the time he handed Gordievsky over to the Soviet side, Gordievsky had already done enough that his information had in any case been acted upon. This was untrue. It was an attempt to minimize the scale of his own betrayal. Gordievsky had already been living in London for 3 years by then, and continued to work.